Good afternoon. The doctor is in. I'm Doc Swift, and for my very first video, I'm going to be reading from Chapter 1 of The Last Warpiper, my debut novel, available on Amazon. Chapter 1. The day face rose yellow in the east, pinking the sky with the earliest markers of dawn, chasing the white night face over the far horizon. Sergeant Hark marched north away from friendly lines. He stopped in unison with the other marching soldiers. Hark glanced to each side. 100 paces separated him from his fellow warpipers, and another 100 from the next, while 50 paces separated them from their regular army comrades to the rear. Hark put aside the memory of his first battle, when the regular army fled as the enemy charged. He stood alone that day on the far flank where no battle was expected. Today he was far from the flank and guaranteed to see battle. The grass was cut low from its late spring height. The king's conscripts handled their scythes well. They should, seeing as they were farmers and not soldiers. After 3 back-breaking days and nights of constant labor, the high grass was trimmed to a few inches over the wide swath of plain from the riverbank on the east to the stony foothills of the God's Mount in the west. Behind Hark, the cleared area stretched more than a mile. Ahead it reached another mile. Tall grass still waved on the bluffs carved long ago into the land by the winding river raging 2 miles toward the dawn. Hark checked his kit. His sword, freshly honed, rested in the new scabbard on his right hip. His promotion to sergeant merited the 2-foot blade. He had yet to grow accustomed to it. He missed his father's dagger, stored in his tent with the rest of his meager belongings. Like the shorter blade, the sword was leaf-shaped, the broad section 2/3 of the way down the length providing a weighty aid to chopping and devastating wounds when stabbing. The blade moved easily when he partially drew it. He let it drop into place. His hands, face, hair, and left side were smeared with ichthyanthe jelly. This was a necessary precaution for the usage and anger of the weapon worn on his left side. It was one of the weapons that gave the warpipers their name. The last piece of his battle kit was the leathery, scaly bag hung over his left shoulder and pressing into his left side under the arm. 3 long, rod-like drones stuck out from the top of the bag to rest on his left shoulder. The drones were carved from stonewood because neither wood nor bamboo could survive such use. The mouthpiece was also stonewood, as were the stocks connecting it and the drones to the bag itself. This much narrower cylinder was fitted with a special valve that prevented the air in the bag from passing back up into the user's mouth. The chanter was the final piece of his pipes. This was fashioned from actual precious wood, burnished from long years of use. The chanter contained a reed, which vibrated as air passed over. Like regular bagpipes, notes were played by covering finger holes along the chanter's length. Hark blew into the mouthpiece, inflating the bag partially. The drones immediately began their call, muted as air escaped the bag without being squeezed. He adjusted the drones, twisting and tugging slightly until their tones merged into a single note. Satisfied that the pipes were prepared, Hark allowed the air to vent from the bag. He took a slime-dipped wad of cloth from his pocket and stuffed it into his left ear. Hark was ready for war. He just needed the enemy to arrive. He turned and glanced to the west. A large tent squatted atop the first rise in the rocks. A large white flag waved from the pole planted before the tent. Hark knew that within that tent the king was meeting with the leader of the enemy army, the Pride Lord of the Phyllanths. The cat people referred to themselves as Kassan, but what they called themselves was mostly academic at the moment. They were the enemy of the Primanths. In the same way the Phyllanths called themselves Kassan, the Primanths called themselves humans. Already the catfolk advance into Primanth lands had shattered several smaller realms. The kingdom itself might be lost if the savage warriors were not stopped. They had to be stopped here. If the king failed to negotiate an end to the fighting, then the warpipers would end the invasion in a more brutal and lasting fashion. Fighting and killing were nothing new to Hark. He had worked his whole life to be a warpiper, as his father and grandfather had been. The warpipers were professional soldiers, the king's best. There were other true soldiers in the kingdom, and even some among the lesser Primanth powers that surrounded the kingdom, but the warpipers were the best. Constant training in all forms of warfare made them stone killers, but their warpipes made them unique. Hark made sergeant after only 5 years. His career was marked for success after his first battle. though it was truly the events immediately following that battle that ensured his career trajectory. On a different sort of battlefield, against a different foe, Hark had fought alongside the same warriors he would now be fighting against. Hark had no quarrel personally with the Phelants. He knew them to be fine and noble warriors. They were savage killers of a like unknown to most of Hark's fellow Primants. Most men had never even laid eyes on a cat person before. Those who had never forgot, especially those who witnessed their ferocity in battle. It was the Kassan, truly, who turned back the tide of the Arctanth invasion when the Bear Folk invaded the lands of both Primanth and Phelanth 5 years gone. Ever had the Phelants and Primanths been allies, since before the Gods' War even. Hark did not know why the Phelants had invaded, nor why their attacks were so brutal and savage if the accounts of the refugees fleeing the carnage were to be believed. Hark knew only one thing, that he was about to kill those he had fought beside. He did not know how to feel about that. That was a concern for later. Thinking about that had already roiled his insides in the 3 weeks since word of the war reached the kingdom and the Warpipers had been mobilized. The enemy arrived. At first they appeared from the high grass across the field in ones and twos, then in larger and larger groups. Never did the waving grass betray the motion of the enemy army moving through it, despite many of the enemy warriors being taller and heavier than Hark's 6 feet and 200 pounds. Under other circumstances, Hark might have smirked. His own report of Phelanth's stealth abilities in high grass 5 years ago brought the Scythemen out from their farms in the first place. The Primanth army had learned from their allies and, now that they were enemies, would not fall afoul of sneaking Kassan as had the Arctanth army. Instead of gathering by clans or tribes or even nations, the warriors of the Kassan people formed instead a mismatched mass of varying colors and patterns. Warriors with spotted coats mingled among those with striped or splotchy or reticulated coats. The distance was great, but Hark did not see any of the Great Fang people. Nevertheless, the sleek yet heavily muscled bodies of the enemy force were more than intimidating without the most primitive of their kind. Each Phelanth wore a breechcloth, wound tight to their flesh. Their bellies and chests were wrapped in several layers of thick, heavy cloth. Their necks were enclosed by studded or spiked collars, which were tied via several cords to the torso wraps. Their furry arms and legs were uncovered. As when he fought alongside them, none of the Kassan carried weapons. They preferred to use those they were born with. Each sizable Phelanth paw and foot sported long, evilly sharp claws. Hark had seen the effect those claws had on tough Arctanth hides. They would find little resistance from Primanth flesh. Unlike the enemy, though, Hark and the Warpipers wore thick gambesons over chest and arms, and mail gorgets protected their throats. Their legs were less well protected, as additional padding might restrict their maneuverability. Thick trousers with padding along thigh and calf would have to suffice. The rest of the Primanth army was outfitted per their own needs, archers typically wearing less than spearmen. Hark twisted about and spared a glance for the men directly behind him. He inclined his head to the sergeant of the archers arrayed amongst the spearmen. The sergeant nodded gravely in return. Hark turned back to the enemy. Hark's life was most assuredly in the sergeant's hands if the enemy reached him. Hark looked to his left, received a nod, then turned to his right and passed the nod down the line. He took a deep breath and blew it out through the mouthpiece. The bag inflated. Hark's fingers found their place on the chanter. He squeezed the bag with his left arm, increasing the volume from the Jones and chanter, blew more in to keep the bag inflated. His breathing reached a steady rhythm. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he began to play. He heard at the edge of his awareness the songs of his nearest comrades intruding upon the otherwise grave silence of the standoff. Each warpiper played a tune of his own choosing before entering battle, each set of unique pipes offering its individual sound. Not all were bagpipes like Hark's. Some were single horns or long highland pipes playing but one note. His comrades played rousing anthems to inspire the regular army soldiers, while others played jaunty tunes popular in brothels. Hark stood out by playing a funeral dirge. He told himself it was not in advance of his own impending death, but in honor of those about to die on the field before him. He might very well be among their number, but that was not his concern. In other battles, his stated reason for honoring both his comrades and the enemy might be little more than words, but in this case it was true beyond the shadow of a doubt. Hark had fought alongside the Phelants. He had the utmost respect for them. He did not want to kill them. They had saved his life that day against the Arctants, but he would do his duty. The notes of his song faded into a dull whine from his drones. His hands went through practice motion, pulling the chanter from its stock and thumbing in the fishman jelly-coated stonewood plug. The chanter went into a second scabbard behind his sword. The Phelants moved forward in unison, not in a charge but in a single step. They voiced their own death songs. The largest roared forth their anger and defiance, while others hissed or yowled their loudest. Each Phelanth warrior possessed admirable lung capacity, for their voiced outrage lasted more seconds than Hark cared to count. It was the single most terrifying moment of his life, worse even than when he stood alone against the charging horde of the Bearman army. Unfortunately for their enemies, warpipers are old friends with fear. It would not shake their focus, though those who survived the next few minutes might suffer nightmares later. Hark pulled his sword a hand's breadth from the scabbard, exposing the sharpened edge of the blade. He pressed his thumb against the edge as the blade dropped back into place. The edge was keen enough that the slit it opened on his thumb caused no pain. He placed his bloody thumb against the runes worked into the scales on the bag of his warpipes. He worked his mouth around the language of the ancients, invoking those runes. A gasp slipped from his mouth as the magic activated, taking some of his life force in the process. He blinked and heaved a shaky breath, gathering himself. The drain was noticeably sharper this time. Am I getting old? He wondered. He blew into the mouthpiece once more. The bag inflated with a dulled roar as the drones belched small flames amid black smoke. Hark knew the warpipers along the line were activating their own pipes. Every set of pipes was unique, using as they did the body parts of monsters to deliver the same hateful weapons those beasts did in life. The bag hanging from Hark's shoulder was not mere leather fashioned to be airtight. It was the throat sack of a dragon. Though none of the beasts had been seen this far east in generations, the fury of one of their flame strikes was Hark's to command. Hark narrowed his eyes. He shrugged his left shoulder, dropping the drones from their upright position. They came to rest on his right forearm. He arrayed them with their open ends spread in a triangular fashion to cover a wide area of the field. Now he waited. The enemy did not make him wait for long. In much the same fashion as the warpipers advanced forth from their comrades, spotted Phelanth warriors strode forth from their own line. These were unlike the thick-built warriors of Clan Lep, whom Hark had met. These warriors were much taller and lankier, almost to the point of gauntness. The spots on their fur appeared solid, while those of the Lep people were more ring-like. Hark's knowledge of the Kassan was far from complete. He had only seen them the one time before, as they preferred to keep to their own lands. Until now. The lanky warriors spread out, though both more numerous and more closely spaced than the warpipers. These warriors stopped as one, looked at one another up and down the line. How like us they are, Hark thought, and how unalike. The spotted warriors bent at the waist and placed their paws upon the ground. Then they leaped forward. Hark gasped around his mouthpiece. The enemy moved so fast they blurred. One instant they were all the way across the field, the next they had covered half the distance toward him. The rest of the Phelanth army charged behind the lead warriors. Hark shook off his shock, blew hard into the mouthpiece, and squeezed hard. A trio of flames jetted forward in tight lances. He fanned the drones side to side, forming a waving wall of death. Similar lances, though of ice, shot forth from the warpiper on his left, and screeching thunderbolts blasted forth on Hark's right. The warpipers were the most feared of human soldiers, and they served only the king. They showed their power in one instant, turning the field from a peaceful greensward into a blighted ruin beset by terrors that haunt the nightmares of all the races of men. No army had ever withstood such beautiful power and terrible glory. Until now. The streaking, spotted warriors never slowed. Despite their hideous speed, they showed considerable agility and reflexes. They timed Hark's flame weaving. Instead of bursting into flames to serve as a warning to the rest, They were soon speeding alongside the jets of flame, avoiding their wrath and closing on the Primanth force faster than even a warpiper's excellent eyes could follow. Hark watched death close in on spotted feet. For an instant, the enemy sprinters revealed themselves to his gaze. Instead of running upright, they used all fours to propel themselves with the power of their arms as well as their legs. Their chests heaved like a smith's bellows, their arms pulling and their legs pushing them forward. Their lean backs curled as their limbs prepared for their next strides. They were indeed slight, perhaps even delicate in any other context. Their long limbs belied the strength they surely possessed. For no limb so delicate seeming should be able to propel so large a form so quickly. Hark swallowed around the mouthpiece, prepared to meet his death and meet his grandfather in Valor Hall. The spotted warrior nearest him would reach him in a blink. The Phelanth leaped, all claws and fangs. Hark refused to close his eyes, and so his salvation surprised even him. The spotted warrior appeared to stop in midair. A loud snap penetrated even through the roar of his drones and the thunder of blood pounding in his ears. The Kassan dropped dead at Hark's feet. 2 feet of bamboo topped by a trio of feathers stuck out from the Phelanth's face. Hark formed a half grin. Screams from behind soured his moment of elation. While his sergeant friend had saved him from one of the runners, many others had no such accurate fire to contend with. They're not attacking the warpipers, Hark realized. Dimly, it occurred to him that even the one killed at his feet had not even been looking him in the eyes. It had been leaping past him, not at him. Hark spared a glance backward. A chill ran down his spine despite the heat of his warpipes. The spotted Phelanths were attacking the archers. Spearmen were defending as well as they might, but the Phelanth warriors were wreaking havoc among the lightly armored bowmen. It seemed the Phelanths had learned Primanth tactics while they were allied, just as Hark's people had learned something of theirs. This will be no easy victory, he thought. Hark returned his attention forward. The slower but still wickedly fast warriors making up the bulk of the Kassan force were nearly in range. He hated himself for what he had to do. The warpiper narrowed his eyes and plied his trade. His trade was death. He plied it well. The Phelanths were the most amazing, graceful, perfect warriors Hark had ever seen. They were beautiful. And he slaughtered them, with tears in his eyes. And that's chapter 1 of The Last Warpiper. If you like what you've read and you want to read the rest, why not give it a look on Amazon? It's available both for ebook and in print. I hope you give it a try. And if you do, please post a review on Amazon letting me know what you think, or maybe even just post a comment here. Or you can contact me on Twitter. I'm at Doc Swift. That's Doc with a K. And I hope to hear from you. Thanks.